Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming to our session, our little fireside chat. My name's Jennifer Chesick, and I'm the author of the Psilocybin Handbook for Women. And this just explores all of the intersections of psilocybin with women's health, so like the menstrual cycle, which we'll talk about, menopause, different conditions that affect, either disproportionately affect the female body or only affect the female body or affect the female body differently, parenting, sex, lots of things in here. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jennifer. My name's Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley. As was mentioned, I am the research director for Heroic Hearts Foundation, but that's not why I'm here today. And a couple of years ago, like many women in this room, I'm sure, I went through a psilocybin journey and noticed a profound change in my menstrual cycle symptoms. And being a researcher, naturally thought, that's interesting. Took myself into the literature to find out what had happened and found out there was bugger all there. No one has been looking at this. So I started speaking to other women, and they started reporting to me the same thing. I took psychedelics and something strange happened. So got together with my academic friends, and earlier this year founded a research organization. It's called Hystelica. We are dedicated to researching and understanding the effectiveness and safety of psychedelics in women's bodies. It has been vastly overlooked by the whole industry, as it has been chronically for years in the medical industry. So I'm hoping we'll get to share a little bit, unfortunately not about what we know, because that is very little, but to shed a little bit of light on why I think this is really important, and shed a little bit of light on what I think we need to start focusing on next.
Absolutely. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we're chronically behind in women's health and the ramifications of that. So one thing that came up for me when I started to do the research for the book was that I learned that in many cases, more women are using psychedelics more frequently than men. And that came as a little bit of a surprise to me. I wasn't expecting that. But when I dug a little bit deeper into the research, it made total sense, because additional research has shown that while men, not all of them, this is an overgeneralization, but a lot of men use psychedelics a little bit more recreationally, whereas women traditionally are turning to psychedelics to self-treat for conditions such as PTSD, other forms of trauma, depression, anxiety, and then all sorts of medical conditions, like chronic pain and all of that. But at the same time, women, these conditions disproportionately affect women. We're also gaslit at the doctor's office quite a bit, and that's really frustrating to me as someone who has endometriosis, which affects 1 in 10 people assigned female at birth. In rare cases, it can also affect the male body. But an example of how far behind we are in the mainstream medical system in understanding these conditions is that so in 2021, the National Institutes of Health designated less than 0.1% of its research funding to studying endometriosis. Now, I'm not here to say that psilocybin can cure endometriosis or do anything very specific with that. I just am hoping we get more research on that. And then another example that I want to share is, so women were largely excluded from early stage clinical trials until about the 1990s. At least that was the case here in the US. And that has put women's health just so far behind. It's on the back burner. And an example of that would be, so in 1998, men had a drug for male sexual dysfunction. Everyone knows what that is. You could all probably name it right here. It's Viagra, right? That was 1998. At that point in time, we didn't even have an accurate picture of what the clitoris looks like. There's all this internal structure to the clitoris. And that didn't happen until 2005, when a doctor named Helen O'Connell, she's a urologist, she did some MRI research and determined this. So 2005, we finally figure out where the clitoris is, and then it wasn't until 2015 that women got a drug for female sexual dysfunction. That is a 17-year gap from when dudes got a drug to when women got a drug for the same condition, even though this type of condition affects bodies differently, and even in female sexual dysfunction, there are many different facets of that. So when I set out to write this book, I was really looking to provide accurate information to women looking to explore with psilocybin, if they're, especially if they're turning to psychedelics to self-treat. I want them to have accurate information about that. And so that brings us, of course, to the menstrual cycle. I'm just briefly going to talk about that, and then I'll hand it back over to the doctor over here. But what I've uncovered in some of my research is that this is research that's coming out of Johns Hopkins. And so when I say research as a journalist, not as a medical professional. I'm not a doctor, and I don't even play one on TV. But so Johns Hopkins has done some case studies and just sort of getting anecdotal reports from women on how psychedelics are potentially affecting the menstrual cycle. And there are sort of 3 things that have come up from that research. And again, these are just case studies and anecdotal reports, so it's not like a robust medical study or a clinical trial. But 3 things that have come up are that there's potential that if when you use psilocybin or another psychedelic, that your period may come a little early. Another thing that may happen is a return to regularity after a period of irregularity with the menstrual cycle, or a return to menstruating after an absence of menstruation. And I don't mean in menopause, I'm talking about in the reproductive years. There are lots of things that can cause a menstrual cycle to kind of come to or stop one from having their period temporarily. So I'm going to hand it over to you if you would like to talk a little bit more about the menstrual cycle.
Absolutely. Before I do that, I'm just going to touch back on the state of affairs in terms of women in medicine in the past. It wasn't until 1993 that it was mandated that women needed to be involved in clinical trials in this country. So rather late to it. And when we look at medicines that have actually been developed specifically for women, the only one that really has been done with any great focus has been one that largely helps men. And I'm talking, of course, about hormonal contraception that affects your weight, affects your skin, affects your mental health. And this may shock a lot of you in here. Actually, it's been shown to reduce the size of your clitoris. So can you imagine if you turn around to a bloke and said, "Hey, buddy, I want you to take this pill and your dick's going to get smaller." "Yeah, sure, no worries. Hand it over." Anyway, so we definitely are seeing these symptoms in terms of changes in people's menstrual cycle as a result of them taking psychedelics. We really don't understand why, because there has never been proper study that has looked at it. Hysterica and the researchers I work with, we were able to launch a survey alongside King's College London earlier this year. I will mention it again at the end of this talk, where we are actually for the first time asking women after psychedelic experiences what changes they have noticed in either menstrual cycle or menopausal symptoms, so we can start to get an indication of what's going on, and then we can start to design research to more specifically look at it. But let's just go on a bit from the menstrual cycle to talk about what that actually is. So I'm hopefully not going to be giving anyone some new biology lesson here in explaining that the menstrual cycle occurs when you have a fluctuation between 2 key female sex hormones, namely estrogen and progesterone. Up until reasonably recently, we've always believed that these hormones were primarily that, sex hormones. They say whether or not you're going to ovulate, whether or not your period's going to come, whether or not your uterine lining is going to build up. And that's how we've always been taught that they affect our bodies. But we're now realizing there's far, far, far more involved in it. In fact, these are very powerful neurosteroids that affect the way that our brains work. They affect not only the way that our brains function, they affect the way that they are structured, they affect the way that individual receptors work in the brain. The reason I'm telling you that and giving you this sort of basic biology lesson is let's think about now, what is the psychedelic world telling us? If you go into a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy program, you're going to take a very, very large dose of psychedelics. What's the first thing you will need to consider? Set and setting. Well, let's just take it for a moment and think about a woman. She's going into psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. She's about to take a very large dose of psilocybin, and she's about to ovulate. Her estrogen is super high. That means that her serotonin receptors are even more reactive. Her whole serotonin system is more heightened. You're now adding a drug that acts with the serotonin system on that. So surely that's going to have a different effect than if she then takes that drug 2 weeks later. Progesterone is super high at this point. Estrogen's gone. It's really, really low. What do we know happens when we have really high progesterone? We get changes in things like the GABA receptor. Well, what does that mean? It means you get much increased amounts of intrusive thoughts. If we just look at it from a perspective of how women feel in that period, you get a 25% increase in suicides in women during their premenstrual period. You actually get a 20% increase in women who are sectioned in mental health facilities during that period. So why is it that all of the clinical trials that are going on right now using psychedelic substances don't seem to be taking note of the fact that in women's bodies, these drugs are going to have very different safety and efficacy at these different points in the month? Surely, thinking with my, pharmaceutical company hat on here, going into clinical trials, I want to mitigate every risk possible. That's why they excluded women from clinical trials until they had to put them in, because they know that this is something that affects women. They know that we're on a cyclical, monthly change that changes physiology within our bodies. Surely then it makes sense for somebody to be looking at this, to somebody to be understanding it, so that we can approach these new protocols in a way that actually looks at women's bodies in the way that they're working and not ignores it and treats us as we have been treated as little men, which is at best insulting, at worst negligent.
Yes, very much so. Thank you. And just to sort of piggyback on that, in terms of the menstrual cycle, our menstrual cycles occur along what's called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And what I mean by that is that when we have our follicular phase and then ovulation and then our luteal phase and then get our periods, that's all occurring in this feedback loop of hormones one hormone tells another hormone what to do, and so forth and so forth. And we also have another axis, and everyone has this axis. It's the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And when we are using a psychedelic like psilocybin, for example, that one activates your serotonin receptors and affects that HPA axis. But you can tell that these two axes overlap. So it's not a stretch to understand that if we're using psilocybin, we may be impacting our cycles. And if we are on our cycle, depending on where we are in our cycle, that may impact our trip. If we have a trip experience, that may impact that. So all of this is super important, and I'm really hoping researchers continue to look into this, or start looking into it, really. I'm excited that Johns Hopkins started the research, but I am hoping that it continues and that we get a lot more robust information. I would love to talk about menopause for a second, and then I think you have some menopause stuff to share as well. So I do see a lot of potential for psilocybin and other psychedelics to help people in menopause. We need research on this, and we don't have it. You'll hear us say that over and over again. We don't have the research. Hint, hint, researchers out there, study the female body. But with menopause, one of the first things one of the main symptoms of menopause, or it can be, is depression. And so, if you go to your doctor and you're in perimenopause, moving towards that menopause threshold, if you have depression, they'll probably stick you on a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is an SSRI, an antidepressant. And so, those are great medications. I am not here to say those are bad medications, but what do? They also kind of tamp down your libido. And so many women also have female sexual dysfunction in the menopause years, in that perimenopause period and beyond. And so it's essentially like if you take an SSRI, you might just be blunting your libido even more and exacerbating some of these menopause symptoms. So what other research has started to show is, well, we know that SSRIs also blunt mood. So not only do they blunt your lows, but they also blunt your highs. Well, psilocybin doesn't do that. It acts on your serotonin receptors, but it doesn't necessarily blunt your mood. And research is showing that instead, it makes you feel a little bit more okay with your highs and lows, which is really exciting to me. So I see some beneficial effects that could be happening for helping with female sexual function, which I wrote about in the book. I don't want to take up time talking about that. But additionally, the other thing that is, a possibility, but again, we need research, and we don't have the research on this. What we do know from research is that if you've had adverse childhood experiences, these are things that are traumatic that happened in childhood. It could be violence in the home, living through a natural disaster. There's all sorts of adverse childhood experiences, and so many of us have them. 1 in 6 adults has 4 or more ACEs. That's what adverse childhood experiences are. They're called ACEs. And what we do know from research is that if you've had 4 or more ACEs, you're more likely to have worse menopause symptoms. I see a lot of potential for psilocybin to help us reset the nervous system a little bit. And we're seeing some research, coming out on, things like PTSD, trauma, all of that, to suggest that that might be the case. So I'm hoping that there's a lot of potential here for psilocybin to help with that menopause transition. And I did talk to an indigenous wisdom expert when I was doing all of my research, because it's so important that when we talk about psilocybin, that we recognize that that is a sacred substance, and we need to be bringing in indigenous wisdom with that. And one thing that she said to me was that we need to stop thinking about menopause as this horrible thing. It's a phase in life. It is a transition, and of course we can parallel how mushrooms, my book is about psilocybin. I know we have other psychedelics out there, but we can think about mushrooms as these great transitioners, and perhaps there's ability to help. So I'm going to turn that over to you to talk about menopause.
Yeah, before we get on to the menopause bit, just to come to what you were saying about the idea of trauma and the way that trauma is stored in the body, there's very good evidence to suggest that women's bodies actually store trauma in a slightly different way, and even in a heightened way. And when you really think about it, we're all just creatures out here trying to survive, right? And like it or not, women, we are the weaker of the two sexes. Our bodies are just here to try and keep us safe and to try and keep us alive. It makes sense that if you are a female, you are going to experience trauma at a higher level, particularly because you are going to experience the threat to your life perhaps at a sooner point than what a male would. Just to kind of prove my point on that, if you look at the statistics in terms of not just mental health disorders, but physical health disorders, women have double the number of autoimmune diseases that are, well known to be connected with trauma. So many women, with fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, et cetera, and you look into their history and they've had a traumatic experience when they're younger, it doesn't surprise me that would also link up with having worsened menopause symptoms. When we talk about the menopause, I think, the classic symptoms is to think about sort of the brain fog and all the rest of it, that, of course, psychedelics may have a very beneficial mechanism towards helping in the way that they do within the serotonin receptors. But menopause is also a huge marker for a lot of inflammation in the body and a huge amount of neuroinflammation in the body. And when you get inflammation in the brain, what happens is you reduce neuroplasticity and you reduce neurogenesis. So not only do we need to think about these psychedelics in the sort of concept of what they might be able to do on a psychological level and thinking about them in doing a macro dose, but something I've been thinking about recently is, well, what about the women who can't use HRT? What about the women who can't use estrogen replacement therapy because of cancers or similar? Well, if you look at the mechanisms that take place with psychedelics, there's actually an awful lot of crossover there. So Hysterica and myself, we are about to start researching what we are seeing in women who are menopausal and start microdosing. So that's one thing, but there's another part that we all need to consider. And what else do you get when you are in the menopause? An increased risk for cardiovascular disorders. Well, what's one thing we know about psychedelics? They work on the 5-HT2B receptor, which is in the heart. So before we all run out there and tell people, right, start doing this, we need to understand as well, is this going to be safe in women's bodies who already have this heightened risk for cardiovascular?
Absolutely, well said. Should we open it for Q&A, or do you have more? You probably have more.
Definitely. I always have more. Yeah, absolutely. So coming to that safety point, and that for me is as much of the reason that I started the company was about women being safe, and as safe as they can possibly be using these substances, as well as all of the other efficacies which are quite particular to women. So like we've spoken, PMDD, postnatal depression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when it comes to safety, one thing exactly to my last point is that point of women experimenting on their own bodies in the lack of research. It's gone on for years. It's not unique to the psychedelic space, but we're given this opportunity in the sort of new world of psychedelics to not let it kind of happen again here. And the reason I'm sort of bringing it up is I've seen a lot of stuff happening recently where women have had an experience themselves, something has happened, they go to the literature, they go to their physician, they go to psychedelic forums, can't really see much there, and so they share their own stories and they share them in a way that is advising to other women. And I think we also need to be cautious in doing that. I've seen examples recently in the PMDD world, that's premenstrual depressive disorder, of people recommending all sorts of different protocols of how people should use psychedelics to treat PMDD. Now, some of those protocols are going to be completely valid. Some of those protocols are going to be effective. But I've heard of some people taking psychedelics in that premenstrual time. And when we think about what psychedelics do, they're huge amplifiers to the body. What did I say earlier? 25% increase in suicide rate. If you've got suicidal thoughts, the last thing you want to do is take a psychedelic on your own in your bedroom because you're trying to cure some kind of disorder for which you've probably been ignored by your physician for years. So that's just a word of warning from me. I want to get up on these stages. This is actually the first panel I have ever seen put on at a conference, and I've been to the psychedelic conference rodeo 1 or 2 times before. This is the first time I've actually seen a panel put on talking about women's biology and psychedelics. So
and of
hopefully
course
it won't be
it's
the
at
last.
the end of the conference. I do want to point that out, like an afterthought.
Yeah.
I'm going to point that out.
So we need to start talking about this, and we need to be careful how we advise other women, but definitely make sure that our voices are heard. I believe that within all the women, around the world, particularly in the indigenous communities, we do hold this knowledge within us, but we need to kind of come together, because the boys ain't going to do it for us, girls,
Nope.
just letting you know that, and bring that knowledge together, because I do believe that we do have the answer to a lot of the things that we've got up here today and said that we don't have answers for. And if we can collect that knowledge from between the community of us, then we can start to understand what we're doing. Then we can start to get a signal of, right, okay, what are we seeing here? Then we can start to really pressure the pharmaceutical companies who are running around trying to find indications novel enough for them to make some money out of. Well, how about you turn around and check the other 50% of the population who are standing here waiting for somebody to acknowledge us and treat the conditions that we have long gone ignored, understood, and untreated. So,
Yeah, I'm going to add one more thing, and then we'll go to Q&A. You just reminded me of something, and I wrote about this in the book. But so a few years ago, I had a blood clot in my arm, and it was caused by birth control. I'm not against birth control. I think if you need it, go for it. If you want it. But it caused a blood clot in my arm, and it could have been very serious. I was in the ER and everything. And I wrote an article about it because I'm a journalist, and of course I'm going to share my experience, because we don't expect people in their I'm in my 40s now, but at the time I was in my 30s to have blood clots. Especially healthy young women, you would think that wouldn't happen, but it did. And immediately after having a blood clot, I was put on a blood thinner temporarily to make sure that I didn't have another one. And then I got my period, and I don't know if any of you have been on blood thinners and got your period. You will think that someone has murdered you, and you didn't realize it, because it's just, blood fest. And so this has happened to other women too, where they get put on a blood thinner, and then suddenly they get their periods and are freaking out. So what do? They go online and they look for information, and they come across my article having written about the blood clot, and then they start asking me questions as if I'm a doctor. And why is that happening? It's because there's not information out there, and women are getting gaslit at their doctor's offices for pretty much everything. So I appreciate that you brought up the safety aspect, that we shouldn't be turning to Reddit for help, but I want to express why that is really happening, which I know I mean, I just, it's frustrating that we're not getting adequate care in the mainstream medical system. But yes, we do need to be extremely safe with psychedelics. That's so important.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, I guess we have a little time for
questions.
Yeah,
we have some Q&A time. Go for it.
Yeah, so I have been looking a little bit at this. Obviously, we don't really know everything. We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know if it's safe. I mean, certainly there's a lot of indigenous communities that do use psychedelics all the way through their pregnancy. I'm not saying that that's an advocate to do it, but I think that there's probably some knowledge and some wisdom we could look to understand. But it's definitely something I've been thinking of in terms of women who are experiencing fertility problems. Not in all cases, but a lot of fertility problems are caused by stress. They're caused by people being completely out of whack with their bodies. And I think that psychedelics actually offer a really interesting opportunity for women who are struggling to get pregnant to maybe, come to terms with the fact that that's happening to them, because I know a lot of my friends who've been through it. It can be really debasing to suddenly think something that was going to happen like that doesn't happen. But I think it also offers an opportunity to regulate the nervous system, and potentially that could be helpful in terms of helping people to fall pregnant.
Yeah, multi ways that it potentially could be helpful. Great answer.
I mean, I think there's a gap for all minorities in research, but I certainly don't think women are a minority. We're 50% of the population.
We are.
And the lack of research on women, I'm not for any moment taking away from those communities at all, but the lack of information that we have on 50% of the population, for me, I have to focus all my energy on that right now.
Very good. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that we've got technology.
Yeah,
so just asking about how a pharmaceutical company might start thinking about how they look at menstrual cycles within their study design. Wearables. If you go to the Oura Ring or many of the other ones out now, they've got incredible tracking ability. It only takes a small correlation to be able to consider that and track women where they are in their cycles. There's preclinical data out there that has shown, within rat and mouse models, what the different effects are within different psychedelics and their effects. So I'd start by doing a lot more preclinical work to understand in terms, I'm not sure exactly what your product is, whether it's a microdose or a macro dose. Well, start by actually asking women where they are in their cycles. I haven't really seen anyone doing that. So start there. And then secondly, I'd say I think with wearable devices, you've got a really good opportunity to properly get under the hood and understand where people are in their cycles. I don't think it's beyond pharmaceutical companies, I also work for one, to factor this in and pay for that kind of study.
Also, perhaps checking hormone levels during clinical trials and seeing not only just tracking where we are in our cycles, but what are the hormone levels, because it's going to vary across the board depending on conditions that people might have. So, yeah, great question. Right here with the glasses. Take her survey.
Yeah, take my survey.
Yeah, she has a survey. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, so get yourself involved in research as and when it comes. Like I say, I have a piece of research here that I will leave the leaflets on the edge of the stage for you to do. It's for women who have done a large dose of psychedelics, and it asks you about sort of what happened to you after that, to try and do that. But I think the other one is to think about when we think about retreat spaces as well. I think they need to start thinking about this. Just because you can load a bunch of women onto a retreat, actually you need to be asking them where they are in their cycle and thinking about whether it's the right time for that woman to go through that process.
Anybody else? Over there. Well, I think we really just need more research on that. We don't have definitive answers on that, or even we haven't even started that process of researching that and figuring that out. But I did talking to the indigenous wisdom expert that I spoke to. And I always like to remind people that, we think of science as the process of doing things over and over again to reproduce the same results, but that is exactly what indigenous communities have done for a long time. So I valued this woman's input. Her name is Michaela De La Maico. She does what's called mush womb consciousness. So she helps people navigate their cycles and works with psilocybin and all of that. And so she recommended that if you're doing a deeper journey, to do it closer to ovulation rather than when you get closer to having your period. And there's certainly some scientific reasoning for that. For one, as we get into our luteal phase, as we get closer to our periods, we tend to become more insulin resistant in the body. And that can, certainly be very energy depleting during a journey, and journeys themselves can be very energy depleting temporarily until you kind of recover from that. And so we have more available glucose energy in our body, and the way that the body is metabolizing all of that is a little bit more succinct during that ovulation period. So she recommended that. But again, we need scientific research to dig into this much more.
Yeah, I agree with you. Just based off what we know now, which ain't a lot, rule of thumb, probably in the week before your period, maybe not a good time.
Right. Good. Anybody else? Right here. All right. With the glasses and the white sweatshirt. You got it. You're up. We can't hear you, I don't think. Can you shout it out? Yeah.
Are you going to ask about experiential differences? Is that what?
Into indigenous and also cycles of the moon and things like that go along with the biology. So there's a lot of scientific base, and of course that's the context of the talk. But have you in your book written anything about those different cycles and getting back in connection with the feminine aspects of the 50% of the population, and with those indigenous studies, that's really a foundation that I've seen. Is there's these groups of women and they're studying cycles of the moon and working with that more so and equally along with the biology. Have you done any research on that at all?
I personally have not. Have you? Do you have any information here?
About cycles of the moon? No, no, I haven't. No, but I am, aware, obviously, of indigenous groups doing a lot more work on this, but I haven't had an opportunity to explore it. As I say, I think it's definitely one of the avenues by which we can go and start finding out stuff that already is out there in the consciousness.
Yes.
But we'll let you know when we do.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? We can probably do one more. Go ahead.
My question is really simple. I just walked in, but what about the week that you are on your moon cycle? That you already started, like day one.
Taking psychedelics then?
Yeah, like a psilocybin.
Yeah, I during that period, your progesterone has then dropped, so there is a kind of theory, but your energy levels are also quite low during that period. And I guess for me, it would just be more around, the basic stuff. If you're experiencing a lot of pain, a lot of menstrual cramps during that time, it might be quite unpleasant to then be in a psilocybin journey. And I'm not sure I'd want to be changing tampons during my psilocybin journey.
No thanks.
Just from a practical aspect, it might be a bit much. But it's that very high progesterone point, in the day or two before your period. That's when you kind of have that higher risk for having a bad trip and all the rest of it. But during the period, it's more of an energy and convenience and pain thing.
Another consideration that, again, the indigenous wisdom expert brought up to me was that a lot of people before a psychedelic journey will do a little bit of fasting, and that might be in the days before or just the day of or the hours leading up to that. And it's very difficult in your luteal phase to fast, especially as you get really close to your period, to fast. And so you may be able to do that more accessibly closer to ovulation. Are we good? We're good.
Just one last thing. I'm going to leave these here for my survey.
Plug all your stuff. Where can people find out more?
Oh, great question. So I have books with me if anyone would like to purchase one. Happy to sign it or whatever. And then you have a survey. You can find me online at Jen Chesick. You can look up there.